I don't think it's too much of a stretch to assume that a decent portion of the Final Fantasy XIV player base, especially those who are caught up on the main scenario, have two favorite Final Fantasies. The first is Final Fantasy XIV, and the second is whichever was their favorite before they played 14. I say this because, well, that also describes me, and I'm pretty damn confident that I'm not the only one that this applies to. For a long time after its 2.0 rebirth, I knew Final Fantasy XIV was a good game, but I always assumed it'd be too held back by the fact that it's an MMO to truly deliver on the story and character-driven experience that many Final Fantasy games had. As I'm sure you can guess, that assumption was unequivocally wrong. In this video, I'm going to reflect a lot on my time with the critically acclaimed MMORPG, describing my experience and giving mini reviews of a sort for each expansion. Before we dive into the meat and potatoes of the video though, I should give fair warning. There will be spoilers here for the base game and every expansion afterward. It is strongly recommended that you at least be caught up in the main scenario questline before you watch this video. Because regardless of being an MMO, Final Fantasy XIV is still a heavily story-driven experience, and I cannot possibly overstate that enough. Now that the warning's out of the way, let's begin the video proper. On June 22nd, 2019, after many months of stalling and simply not working up the care, I finally started playing the popular MMORPG, Final Fantasy XIV. Well, despite saying I finally started, however, I have a bit of a pre-established history with it. While I wasn't one of the people who played 1.0, thankfully, I actually participated in both the PC and PS4 betas for A Realm Reborn. I enjoyed them too. I vividly remember every beta player walking around the areas surrounding Ul'dah and stopping what they were doing to participate in nearby fates whenever they popped up, as if each one was an important event we absolutely had to do. It was fun. However, despite my positive experience, I never got around to purchasing the full game. As for reasons why not, I had little beyond my own misguided assumption that it might not feel like a true Final Fantasy experience due to being an MMO. I guess there's also the combined factors of just having other games I wanted to play, plus not wanting to shell out money on a subscription, and not wanting to play a game where playing with others was necessary for progression. Yes, I was one of those people who wanted an all-solo experience in an MMO. Sounds a little counterproductive, I know, because one of the MMO genre's conceptual pillars is being an interactive social hub. But I was, and still am, the type of person who always felt that I do better at something when it's at my own pace. Either way, I went on with my life, not touching the game again until fairly recently. To provide context, my reasons for eventually coming around to playing the full game are a mixture of things building up over the preceding year and a half or so. The biggest is probably my time with Warframe. It was the first MMO-like experience that I put a significant amount of time into. Until then, I would only fiddle with MMOs with passing interest, not sticking with any for a long enough time for them to really give a lasting impression. Throughout my life, I've touched several MMOs without ever fully committing to them. There was Dark Age of Camelot way back in the day, World of Warcraft for like 10 minutes, Lord of the Rings Online, Rift, Vindictus, and probably a couple more I can't even remember. However, due to friends beckoning me over to become a space ninja, specifically friends who were very unsatisfied with the state of Destiny 2 at the time, I found myself dedicating many hours to Warframe, putting about 300 hours of playtime into it over 2 months. I basically played it every day. I did enjoy it quite a bit, I think. At the time, I felt like I did at least. The learning curve was pretty steep, but with the guidance of my friends, I was able to catch up in no time. I would spend entire afternoons doing random missions and cracking open some cold relics with the boys for some special blueprints or prime weapon parts. Eventually, my friends went back to Destiny 2 and I fell off the game. But I returned about a year later to invest another 100 hours or so into it before falling off yet again. because I reached the end game at the time and it just felt meaningless. Again, I thought I was liking it, but eventually the grind grew tiresome. Warframe's biggest weakness soon reared its ugly head. It's a tangled mess of a game plagued by feature creep, bogged down by parasitic game elements that need the clearance of past content to be accessed, but without adding anything evergreen to the game on their own. Every update added something new with the promise of being even better in the future, but that almost never happened. It seemed like Digital Extremes was only interested in adding content for content's sake instead of dedicating the time into making everything function like a well-oiled machine with synergy between game modes. I realized I was just throwing myself at these tasks with little to show for my success or dedication. I stayed long enough to acquire Mesa Prime, my #1 space cowgirl, but once I got her, I had no real reason to stick around anymore. Looking back on it now, I realize that Warframe is quite possibly the most fun MMO that I didn't actually enjoy all that much. I stopped playing it and began a search for something new. I considered other live service games, but I'm not really all that interested in Destiny or The Division, and any other live service game beyond those two just ended up being a failure in one way or another. Soon I realized I just wanted a good old-fashioned RPG experience, and it eventually led me to remember that Final Fantasy XIV had a free trial. It is not the incredible free trial we know and meme about now, which includes the award-winning expansion Heavensward and no restrictions on playtime. In 2019, the free trial was still only up to level 35, which is barely the halfway point of a Realm Reborn content. But it seemed like a good enough deal to me. Recalling my overall positive time with the betas, I decided to download the game on PlayStation 4 and jump in with my old account, only to find out that you can't use the free trial if you participated in the beta, which is incredibly lame. Thus, I was forced to make a second PSN account dedicated to Final Fantasy XIV. I figured this would end up being a waste if I didn't enjoy the game as much as I hoped, but I was willing to go through the trouble anyway. After finally making a new PSN account, I began my free trial and, to the best of my ability, tried to recall the path I took in the beta. I ended up making my character a male Hewer, a Midlander, and chose Gladiator for my starting class. It's probably the most milquetoast character imaginable for a first-timer, but technically not really a first-timer, but whatever. With that, I begun my journey, starting off in the city-state of Ul'dah, just as I did years prior. I learned about the Seventh Umbral Calamity, which was what ended 1.0 in a super cool way, by making the closing of it a canon event that leads into 2.0. And I learned about the imposing threat of the Garlean Empire, and met my Scion buddies who honestly came off as straight-up geeks and didn't seem all that interesting at first, but man, would I eventually learn otherwise. The main questline for Realm Reborn isn't especially outstanding for either an MMO or RPG in general, but it was enough to push me forward with a solid amount of investment. I slowly rose through the levels, and I say slowly because I did not join a preferred server, meaning I did not receive a Road to 60 experience point buff. Wandering around Thanalan with my own 2 feet, getting used to the basics of combat, though there isn't much to it at first. Soon I hit a high enough level to finally participate in dungeons, the thing that made me hesitant for so long, because they are party-based duties and I knew they were mandatory for progression. I've heard a lot of horror stories about bad party members in MMOs, and I would have hated to either be stuck with one or worse, be one. At this point, I was still unaware of the Final Fantasy XIV community's reputation of being more welcoming than others. But I did know that online game communities always have at least some percentage of toxicity, and it was only a matter of time before I encountered some aimed at me, whether I deserved it or not. But if I wanted to continue playing the game that I was enjoying, I had to suck it up and play with others, so I dove in. As a gladiator, I was a tank. I may be overall inexperienced with MMOs, but I knew what a tank's role was, as some non-MMOs I've played still adhered to the healer, tank, and DPS trifecta, but with different labels. As the tank, it was my job to stay at the front of the party, draw all of my enemies' aggro, or enmity as the game calls it, and ensure none of my teammates were engaged by them. Basically, if I stay alive, then everyone else stays alive. Thankfully, I didn't need to be told to avoid area of effect attacks, and I made sure to utilize my defensive buffs at opportune moments. For all intents and purposes, I was an okay tank, despite the sprout next to my name being so fresh. That's what I'm assuming at least, because I never heard a complaint from any healer who was keeping me alive. But maybe they were just being polite. And it wasn't until even later that I discovered that by simply being okay, I was already better than a decent chunk of other tanks because, man, no matter how many hours I put into this game, I still see tanks of all shapes and sizes, sprout and no sprout, refuse to turn on their stances or use their cooldowns. It's almost impressive sometimes. The old free trial of Final Fantasy XIV, while fairly generous with the amount of content available, also had some big restrictions. For one, you could not access the player-run market board, which meant getting new equipment the hard way, grinding for them. This wasn't that much of an issue for your main job that you play through the main scenario quest with, but it could be an issue if you wish to level up a second or third job later. You also couldn't join a free company, known as guilds in other games, which meant rejecting the many invitations I received from FCs looking for sprouts to swoop up. I must have denied at least 20 during my time in the trial. It was a little annoying sometimes, I'll be honest. And thirdly, you could not send a private message, to people, which made for awkward moments when a few people would send me one, and, not knowing where they were located, forced me to just ignore them like a jerk because I didn't want to do a zone-wide shout just to reply. The fourth restriction is the most obvious one, being a free trial and all. The level cap of 35. It may seem like a low number at first, especially in comparison to the current free trial that goes up to 60 and includes the entirety of Heavensward. One may assume it's a cap that's deceptively easy to achieve in a day or two, but that's not necessarily the case. For a new player, especially one without the gracious road to 60 or 70 semi-permanent buff that doubled all experience gained from all activities, it was a rather slow climb. I'd say it took almost a week to hit level 35 as a paladin. However, instead of immediately buying the game, I decided to try a different class to ensure that I felt some semblance of investment for another form of combat. Thus, I picked Arcanist, one of the 2 available offensive magic classes at the time. Can't get much more different from sword and board tanking than that. It took a while to get used to, much more so than the comparatively simple and straightforward Gladiator, but eventually I got into the swing of things. But due to my favor for more expedient offense, I wasn't really a fan of cast times. I enjoyed summoning my little carbuncle buddy to fight alongside me though. It made combat all the more tolerable. Soon I hit level 35 with Summoner as well, and I finally decided to commit to a purchase of the base game, after I played one more class. Yeah, I was kinda stingy at the time, but I was interested in leveling up multiple jobs and I wanted to get a decent taste of them so I would know that I truly enjoyed the game's combat in general and not just Paladin. After all, this is a subscription-based game, so I needed the reassurance that I would truly love it if I were going to fork over a monthly fee. This time I wanted something physical again, and preferably fast. In the free trial, only one choice really matched that criteria: Rogue. It was fun and played exactly how I expected it to, which is quick and with an emphasis on finesse and sneakiness. My time as a melee DPS helped me observe multiple things. First, as I mentioned earlier, a pretty significant amount of new tanks don't absorb the rules of their role all that easily. I'm not tooting my own horn or anything because I'm not all that special and I honestly haven't tanked in a while as of making this video. But there was definitely a period where tanks I played with just didn't know that their tank stance existed. And as someone who began their Final Fantasy XIV journey as a tank, it was quite frustrating playing under them while leveling up my DPS jobs. But I didn't give them any grief over it. In fact, I gave a couple of tips when needed, the most common one being, turn your tank stance on and leave it on. Some newbies still didn't fully catch on and would refresh their stance after every group of trash mobs, but that's honestly still preferable over never turning it on at all. Second, I realized that DPS receive commendations at a significantly lower rate than tanks do. The main reason is probably because tanks are the default choice when opening up the commendation menu, so people who simply throw the commendation out by mashing end up tossing it to the tank. It's pretty rare for me to get triple comms when I'm a DPS, whereas it happened fairly consistently when I was a tank. I decided to make a rule for myself that when I played DPS, I would toss a comm to a fellow DPS if I felt they did a decent job, especially if they were new. As I played more and got better at the game, the commendations while playing as a DPS slowly came in more often, but admittedly still not as often as when I was tanking. Anyways, after I had brought Paladin, Summoner, and Ninja to level 35, I was finally sold on the game. I bought the Starter Edition for $20, which is simply content from the base game, A Realm Reborn. It got rid of all the free trial limitations, of course, and raised my level cap to 50, and even gave me a free 30 days. I was hyped up to finally continue my journey, and I did so with glee. During my time through ARR, however, the 5.0 update for the Shadowbringers release came out, and changed the game for me in some noticeable ways, including removing some of my Paladin skills and totally disposing of the TP meter. It was a pretty daunting change for a fresh-faced player like me who was still getting used to things, but I eventually adapted. I tried to level up Summoner and Ninja alongside Paladin at a consistent pace, but I ended up giving into the temptation of the MSQ constantly and just barreling through content to get to newer challenges. I wanted to make the most of my time with the game, but knowing how much of it I had left to uncover just gave me tunnel vision for what was next. I was just driven to do more new things. With the launch of Shadowbringers though, sometimes North American servers came under stress or even DDoS attacks, forcing Square to begin maintenance a few times. It was because of this that I decided to actually join a Japanese server and make a new character, just so I could be able to play the game while my home server was inaccessible. Thanks to my new knowledge of the game, I joined a preferred server, and my new character had the Road to 70 buff, which, as I mentioned, doubled experience points earned for every type of activity. I started as a Lancer Elezen this time, and thanks to the buff, I got to level 30 in record time. Little did I know, getting the first character you make after buying the game to level 30 would get you a reward of 15 extra free days added to your account. I was totally oblivious to this, but I was ecstatic all the same. Talk about a happy accident. With this added time, I was eventually able to complete all main scenario content at the time, including all of Shadowbringers, before I even needed to pay for a subscription. Crazy, right? This is me getting ahead of myself though, so let's get back to my time in the 2.x content. Eventually, I finally reached the end of A Realm Reborn, participating in 2 special 8-man dungeons, marking the finale of the arc, Castrum Meridianum and the Praetorium. I noticed both of these duties were cutscene heavy, and I wondered if it was possible to skip them, and it isn't. I assumed it's so first-timers weren't pressured into doing so at the behest of other players who had already done it, and after doing some light research later, it turns out that assumption was correct. Apparently, until a patch around Stormblood I think, trying to do these 2 main scenario duties with new players meant those who were watching these cutscenes were bullied into skipping them or threatened with a vote kick by those doing them for the 1000th time via the MSQ roulette, which rewards players with a massive amount of experience. Square addressed this by making the cutscenes unskippable. This would have been avoided if some people just weren't assholes, but like I mentioned before, communities for online-focused games always have a percentage of toxicity in them, even the ones that have a reputation for being nicer than others. Anyways, with my completion of those 2 dungeons, I was officially done with A Realm Reborn, and was beginning its post-game quests leading into Heavensward. With them, however, I was also doing endgame duties, including level 50 dungeons and hard difficulty versions of earlier trials. I also unlocked extreme trials, which for the most part are basically trials designed in such a manner that requires parties to be significantly more organized than 99% of randomly match-made teams. There was also the debut of 24-man Alliance raids over at the Crystal Tower, which is the only Alliance raid arc that's now mandatory for story progression, and for good reason. It wasn't mandatory before Shadowbringers came out, but considering a character introduced here becomes crucial to that expansion, it's for the best that this change is made. This series of raids is basically one huge reference to Final Fantasy XIII, featuring locations, enemies, and bosses that appear in that game, including Amon, Xande, and Cloud of Darkness. Raid content, and the whole game at large really, being used to provide fan service about past Final Fantasies is a pattern that is thankfully kept up pretty much the entire way through. For the most part, the Crystal Tower Alliance raids are brain-dead easy at this point. It's solved content, so to speak. The only time an Alliance would have trouble is if they're made up entirely of new players or people returning after a very long break. That being said, a new player's first experience of these raids is pretty memorable. I don't think I even knew of the existence of 24-man raids in this game beforehand, and they ended up being as chaotic as I anticipated, probably even more so, but they're a fun spectacle that I like doing a lot. Granted, it can get exhausting doing Labyrinth of the Ancients for the 30th consecutive day of Alliance Roulette, but like I said, it's fast and easy for experienced players. What really makes the post-A Realm Reborn content notorious is the story missions. This entire stretch of Final Fantasy XIV's story is considered to be the most boring, longest slog of the entire game, which is understandable if you've experienced it yourself. It just felt like a non-stop onslaught of busy work. Each quest was but a tiny step forward. Progress felt so minuscule on a mission-by-mission basis, you aren't even sure if you're making any progress at all. It was tedious, with only the occasional fun or interesting moment sprinkled around. Those of you who started playing the game within the last year or so likely agree with me on this already, but consider this additional detail. Before Update 5.3 came out over a year ago, A Realm Reborn and Post-A Realm Reborn was approximately 15% longer than it is now. That update truncated a significant portion of the game, shortening or outright removing over 50 quests if my counting was correct. And despite that change, new players hopping into the game today still seem to feel the slog. I still see people consider stopping before they hit Heavensward, which would be a damn shame because they're so close to hitting one of the highest peaks of the game. It begs the question of if the development team will ever come back and truncate Post-A Realm Reborn even more. Probably not, but time will tell. If I have any criticisms about the ARR experience overall aside from the story's pacing issues, it's probably some of the dungeons. Every time I enter the leveling roulette, I utterly dread getting put into either the Copperbell Mines or the Thousand Maws of Toto Rock. The former suffers from god-awful boss fights, if you even want to call them that, and the boring trash mob enemies on top of that don't help much either. The general interior of the dungeon is also quite uninteresting design-wise. And then Toto Rock is just tedious from beginning to end, with two similarly terrible non-bosses. The final boss, Graphius, is a bit better, but not nearly enough to make up for the dullness of everything that came before. Generally speaking, many of the early game dungeons aren't great, but those two are particularly dreary and uninteresting, and my hate for them grows a little more every time I get thrown into them. Back to the main scenario, however, regardless of the tedium of post-ARR questing, I kept pushing forward because ultimately my enjoyment of the game was still very high, and I was still interested in where the story was heading, despite progress feeling unbearably slow. But then, shit suddenly popped off. What really drew me in was the immediate lead up to Heavensward, specifically a massive story event involving the betrayal and assassination of Sultana Nanamo. A lot of new players like to comment on it when they first witness it, and consider it to be probably the first truly memorable and gripping story sequence the game has to offer. I've seen a ton of people refer to it as Game of Thrones shit, but in a positive way. And honestly, I admit that's what my brain immediately likened it to as well. This violent coup against the crown is what guides the player straight to the beginning of the first expansion, and I was ridiculously hyped up. After plodding through all of the boring post-ARR miscellany, the story was finally heading into a direction that seemed really, really investing. It was impossible to contain my excitement. I needed to continue. And I know I'm not the only person who felt this way when it happened. This is the part of the story where it goes from vaguely keeping your attention to practically demanding that you keep progressing, and the vast majority of us obliged. But this was before the new free trial, before Heavensward was free. I had to pay for the starter edition to finish A Realm Reborn, and considering I only purchased the starter edition of the game, I couldn't enter Heavensward immediately. Now, in my desire to not spend money too soon and to spend time on other content, I decided to dedicate some time leveling up my other jobs. Keep in mind, I was still a paladin main at the time. Just as I did in the free trial, before I bought the starter edition, I focused on Summoner and Ninja, and started a couple other jobs just to see what they were like. I made a fair amount of headway for a couple of days, but my patience very quickly dwindled and I buckled under the pressure, leading me to buy the expansions. I just couldn't wait any longer. I needed to see where things went. With all 3 expansions purchased, because the newer one always includes the previous ones, which is a great deal, I was able to not just continue, but eventually finish all of the currently available Final Fantasy XIV content. I now owned the full experience, and I didn't need to be stingy with my money anymore. I could go all in without any regret. Full steam ahead. Beginning Heavensward proper, I was introduced to the region of Ishgard, a land ravaged by constant war between man and dragon that had lasted 1,000 years. This expansion also marked the addition of 3 extra character jobs: Dark Knight, Machinists, and Astrologian. The former 2 I've begun to level up, with Dark Knight being brought up from level 30, the starting level, to level 50, because I had heard it boasted a very interesting and unique job storyline, which ended up being true. The Dark Knight subplot for levels 30 to 50 had a narrative that was essentially about your character, the Warrior of Light, coming to terms with and accepting the frustration they feel when being depended on by the common folk who are lazy or ungrateful. It was a more chaotic, good, anti-hero job story than what was usually offered, and it was enthralling. It provided a very unique perspective on the lawful good hero archetype that almost every MMO forces upon your character. The Dark Knight questline was also special in the way that it was the only piece of content that actually gave your character a voice. Not voice-acted lines per se, but a text box where they spoke their dialogue aloud in-universe. The writer of this questline, Natsuko Ishikawa, would go on to serve as the lead writer for Shadowbringers and Endwalker, but we'll get to those in a bit. I only touched Machinist for but a mere few minutes before deciding to put it off for later, because I honestly wasn't yet interested in ranged DPSing at the time. As for Astrologian, however, frankly, I have no interest in healing, as I feel that it's a type of responsibility that just doesn't suit me, and I hardly ever play support roles in other cooperative games. Though I acknowledge the necessity of doing it if I want to eventually bring all jobs to cap, which I do. I respect good healers for their patience because I know it's a role that can make you very bitter about your party or the general player base very quickly, and that's precisely why I'm not too keen to hop into it. Once I get all other jobs, including crafting and gathering ones, to cap, then I'll begin on healing. Maybe. We'll see. Starting Heavensward, I had half a mind to sort of play through the expansions with their designated canon jobs, because every one of them features a cinematic CG trailer featuring the canon, I guess, Warrior of Light, who changes from warrior to dragoon when traveling to Ishgard. I wanted to go along with it initially, and I did so by beginning the Lancer class content, but just as I did with leveling other jobs, I simply lost my patience and my curiosity led me to continue the content as the paladin I've always been. I went full steam ahead on the story because it was getting really good and I wanted to know what was next. In terms of plot, characters, and general content, it's widely considered by the community at large that Heavensward is a point where Final Fantasy XIV finally hit its stride and transitioned from a good MMO to a great Final Fantasy, and I agree. Heavensward, as an experience, is a series of high points for this game. The story is extremely investing and does a remarkable job at adding an immense amount of history and lore to the world dating back to 1,000 years prior, keeping all of the important world-building details within the game itself, which is something that a lot of online games somehow fail to do today, having their lore accessible outside of the game people are playing. A big thing that struck me about the plot was the believable and understandable motives for participating in the war from both the dragons and the people of Ishgard. Each side had their own collection of advocates for peace and those who thirsted for blood. But it soon became clear that there was indeed a side that was wrong and needed to accept responsibility, and the search for diplomacy was more important than simply defeating one side or the other. The characters who are introduced or simply given more screen time with the expansion are three-dimensional and experience change as the plot goes on, while we, the spectators of the story, often change our opinions of them as people too. Aymeric is a contender for my favorite character in the entire game. I also really like Ysayle. I think Thordan was a great villain, though probably a bit underutilized in the grand scheme of things. Estinian is super cool, Hraesvelgr is fascinating, and Tiamat is probably my favorite minor character. She left a huge impression in the mere minutes of dialogue she had. Midgardsormr also received a ton of attention too, which is great. The area maps are larger and more fun to explore. Dungeons and trials are way cooler than the base game, and the combat has started to become fast enough to be truly engrossing. Heavensward is an improvement all around, and the fact that it's available for free as part of the new free trial is incredible. It's what makes the trial one of the best deals in gaming right now. Square Enix is just offering some of their most profitable games' best content at no cost. Any other company of comparable size would probably be way too stingy to even consider that. So I continued through Heavensward's main scenario, perpetually grasped by its lore, characters, and gorgeous new zones, and before I knew it, I was nearing its end. The climactic finish of Final Fantasy XIV's first expansion was a trial duty against the main antagonist, as they always are for expansions. And while the fight itself was honestly extremely simple and easy, it ranks among the most memorable, if only because of its amazing, blood-pumping presentation, visuals, music, and boss design. You can beat that fight with your eyes closed, even on your first attempt with mildly competent team members, but you want to keep them open anyway because there is some cool shit to witness. It's probably the best example of the game's strength in production value and creating unforgettable visual experiences. The first time you engage in this fight, you probably are thinking about how easy it is in the back of your mind, but you're too busy gawping over all the insane effects and fan-servicey mechanics happening on screen to really care. It's also a major in-universe reference to a past Final Fantasy game. It's not just the final story-related trial of 3.0 content. The fight is also one huge throwback to the Knights of the Round summon from Final Fantasy VII. This isn't the first time the game does this either. For example, in A Realm Reborn, if you do the Hildebrand side questline, you experience multiple trials that are references to old Final Fantasies, complete with new renditions of their original music. It's amazing. The game does this a ton, some of which I'll touch on later, and I'm extremely glad for it, because I was a big Final Fantasy fan already before playing 14. And these moments elevate the experience for me because not only is 14 an astonishing game in its own right, it's also a sincere love letter to every Final Fantasy before it. Content with my experience, I slowly proceeded into doing the other main story quests that begin to finish the post-Heavensward narrative and lead into the start of Expansion 2, Stormblood. During that time, however, I also began doing optional level 60 dungeons and alliance raids. Heavensward introduced normal raids, which were duties that usually involved just a boss fight. However, they strung together to create their own narrative. Now, this isn't to say A Realm Reborn didn't have raids, it did, but they were the Coils of Bahamut, which are longer and more complex than the straightforward activities we had begun to receive starting with the expansion. The difficulty of normal raids was softened up compared to the Coils, but balanced out with savage versions of the raids, which were simply much more challenging versions offering better rewards. For Heavensward, the raid storyline revolved around the Final Fantasy veteran summon Alexander, and a team of goblins attempting to commandeer his powers of time manipulation. It's a very good raid arc, though not my favorite, but there are some duties within it that are extremely fun, including a boss that's basically a Voltron or Super Sentai tribute. It's rad. The Heavensward Alliance raids were also very good. Unfortunately, the game seems completely allergic to giving me the Void Arc in the Alliance raid roulette, but it loves giving me the Weeping City of Mhach and Dun Scythe, to the point where I kind of got tired of them despite liking them. I don't know if I've ever joined a run of Dun Scythe that didn't start with the party wiping to Deathgaze Hollow at least once. It's kind of annoying, but also kind of amusing. But I get it. It's a rough first-time experience for new players. My personal highlight of the Heavensward Alliance raids is probably Ozma in Weeping City, another throwback boss fight, specifically to Final Fantasy IX. I had no idea Ozma was coming the first time I did this raid, and I popped the fuck off when I got to it. It was difficult to contain my awe while also doing the fight for the first time. I busted my ass doing Weeping City and Dun Scythe over and over again so I could get the wind-up Califisteri and wind-up Skahawk minions. Most people care about collecting mounts, but honestly, I prefer collecting minions. They're cute. Now, it was time for me to move on from Heavensward and make my way into Stormblood, which takes the player to the game world's far east. My inner, though admittedly not that far inner, weeb was pretty damn excited. With the official start of 4.0, I would be led to the eastern region of Eorzea, Al Amigo, and eventually the continent of Authard. The content leading up to the expansion focused on the growing Garlean Empire presence in occupied Al Amigo, and the increasingly desperate resistance forces trying to keep them at bay. One of those resistance fighters was Ilberd, who was essentially the lead antagonist of the main scenario quests, bridging the two expansions together after the Dragonsong War. Let's just say he ended up being one of the most impulsive individuals to claim to want to free Al Amigo, and this ended up hurting his home nation a lot more than helping it. Guess you could say he was a bit sloppy. Though there's definitely room to argue that, in a roundabout way, his plan somehow ended up succeeding, because he further pushed the Warrior of Light, the Scions, and the Eorzean Alliance to finally take action regarding Al Amigo's occupation, even though his scheme involving Shinryu ended up the exact opposite of what he intended. Either way, it's a little bit cathartic when you know a villain is going to be written in the in-universe history books as one of the most short-sighted morons of all time. Even if his end goal of liberating his homeland was noble, his methods of doing it were not much so. The structure of Stormblood is quite different from Heavensward, which was rather straightforward in how you uncovered more of the new region. You started at your new central hub city and merely went outwards. However, with the game's second expansion, things are changed a bit. Essentially, the scenario's intro has you making your way to one of your new hub cities, where you'll eventually decide to travel to the region of Hingashi and inspire people to put pressure on the Garleans via the Eastern Front, forcing them to fight two battles at once and spread their forces thin. It's in this very obviously Japan-inspired province that the expansion truly begins, and once you've progressed enough, you return to Eorzea, specifically the Al Amigan front, to continue the fight there. It's an interesting attempt at giving the plot a fresher sense of progression and globetrotting, but it's also drawn a fair share of criticism, with many people feeling that the divided focus between Al Amigo and Authard interfere with the pacing. I admittedly don't feel as strongly about it, but I do agree to an extent. The development of Al Amigo specifically seemed handicapped because its presence was cut in half, while authored seem to get the lion's share of attention and detail because we're there for a longer, uninterrupted portion. I like the design of both regions, but the story implementation probably could have been a bit smoother. Speaking of design, Stormblood is also quite a sight to behold. The new eastern hub city of Kugane is simply gorgeous, and the areas of Yansha and the Azim Steppe are beautiful from all angles, especially the latter's endless sea of green plains, very clearly inspired by Mongolia in both aesthetic and the local populace's nomadic culture. The Alamigo side of the new scenario also features some striking desert locales, especially in an area called the Locks, which has some great architectural stuff. Unfortunately, it also has the most annoying set of ether currents to look for so far. One in particular requires a giant loop that takes about 5 minutes to run through. If I ever go through the game again with a new character, I'll probably just hire someone else to get those currents for me. With the new expansion also comes new jobs. 2 specifically, Red Mage and Samurai. Now, I only did the mission that unlocks Red Mage and I haven't really done anything with it since, so I can't comment on it. That's not because of a lack of interest, I just wanted to focus on other jobs at the moment, specifically melee DPS. And as such, Samurai was interesting to me right off the bat. The first thing I noticed with it when I got started was many branching combos that acquired the player Sen, which allowed an extra powerful attack depending on how many Sen you collected, 1 through 3. It took some clever rearranging of my cross hotbar to make Samurai playable and intuitive for me with a controller. But once I had everything where it needed to be, I was quite hooked. I was still a paladin main at this point, but had been considering a change because I had grown tired of being the de facto leader of every dungeon and having all eyes on me, as you do with tanking, despite being new to the content. I wanted to play a DPS job so I had less pressure to work under and could just hit buttons without being the linchpin that holds the team together. Samurai made the switch to a new main job easier because of the fact it started at level 50. Once I was about halfway through Stormblood, at level 65, I had fully transitioned from Paladin main to Samurai main, and continued the game as such, which ended up being fitting for the setting. My experience with Stormblood was overall positive, though I didn't find the plot to be as intriguing as the thousand-year conflict of Heavensward's, nor did I think the main antagonist of Xenos was particularly enthralling, being a straightforward, bloodthirsty, battle-sexual prince, but the globetrotting aspect of it was quite nice despite its tiny hindrance on the pacing. The awe-striking new areas were more than enough to satisfy me during my time through the content, as well as the amazing music. The main Stormblood theme is truly incredible, and I get extremely amped up every time it comes in. New characters were also very charming too, especially those on the authored side of the world, including the returning Yugiri and Gosetsu. I also enjoy the beast tribes of the Blue Kojin and Ananta. This expansion also features one of my most favorite trials, Susanoo. He's probably the first primal, or one of the first, that truly gave off a strong personality. He wasn't malicious, nor did he seek to ravage the land for the sake of it. He just wanted a fun fight. Susanoo is a prime example of why it was such a good idea to give bosses mid-fight voiced dialogue, because it really helps their characters shine through with much more gusto in the paltry amount of time they're around. More than we would have gotten solely through silent text we might have easily ignored by accident. He also has an absolutely banging theme. If there's something I'm not particularly a big fan of, it's probably the rebuilding of the Doman Enclave, which is a totally optional system that allows the player to make weekly donations to the reconstruction of a major town. Sadly, it boasts no noteworthy rewards despite taking several weeks of full donations to complete. I'm also not a big fan of Lise, or at least her characterization. She kinda ended up being a bit whiny at certain parts of the story. I respect her conviction towards liberating her homeland, and she does have crowning moments of coolness. But she felt like a glorified support character who was forcefully crammed into the scene sometimes, as opposed to a crucial aspect of the narrative that the game wants her to be perceived as. For comparison, it felt like Sir Aymeric was more crucial to Heavensward than Lys was to Stormblood. Maybe that's just me, but it's how I feel. With the completion of Stormblood's story, I was well on my way into its post-game content, including more story missions leading up to the newest expansion, Shadowbringers. This continued the trend of post-expansion MSQ being arguably better than the actual expansion they follow. The Gimlet Dark is one of the coolest dungeons in the game, if only for its expertly done fanservice with all of the Eorzean Alliance members and Far East allies making appearances and participating in the massive battle. And man, don't get me started on the return of Gaius. The man who used to be nothing but a two-dimensional, mustache-twirling authoritarian in ARR turned into one of the most valuable allies and biggest badasses in the game. Pairing him up with Estinian for covert operations in Garlemald is one of the best decisions the writing team made for this story. Can't get enough of those two dudes being Chads. For a long while, Stormblood's Alliance raids, which were Final Fantasy Tactics themed and even took place in a parallel Ivalice that was canon to the 14 world, remained incomplete for me. Trying to join them through the normal, non-roulette duty finder at the time evoked a very, very long queue wait of well over an hour or two, sometimes over 3 on the slowest days. For months, I had only done the royal city of Rabanastre and Rita-Rana Lighthouse, leaving Orbon Monastery untouched. Most people just weren't doing these raids while I was trying to, and I honestly was not keen on waiting 3 or more hours in a queue just to start them. And when I do start them, I'm not looking forward to likely wiping several times and watching several Alliance members dip out one by one, forcing me to eventually do the same, despite all those hours just to begin the damn thing. It happened a few times. Granted, it was the most difficult Alliance raid by a country mile so far, but because of this, I had to just shrug and move on with post-Stormblood content, abandoning Orbon Monastery indefinitely. I did get to complete it eventually, but the fact that I had to leave that whole quest line to collect dust for months on end due to low activity for the raid was pretty disheartening, and it probably is a symptom of the imperfect roulette system. Stepping away from Alliance raids and moving on to normal ones, however, is where post-Stormblood content shines even greater. The normal raid series for this expansion is Omega, which is a reoccurring enemy in the Final Fantasy franchise. But in this game features simulations created by a giant, super intelligent battle robot made to collect data on the strongest beings. To do that, it creates enemies lifted from in-universe myths and legends for the player to battle. This sounds like an excuse to include a ton of throwback bosses from previous Final Fantasy games, and guess what? That's exactly what it does, including Exdeath and Kefka, and it fucking rules. Omega has awesome fights that I enjoyed a lot, and the fanservice really tickled me in the right ways. I loved it. It really drives the point home that while mainline Final Fantasy games are unrelated to each other directly, they still share the same multiverse, so to speak. One game's mythology and legends is another game's reality. I've always dug that about this franchise, and the way that 14 leans into it is one of the best I've seen so far, and it continues after this. Finally, after almost 2 months of plowing through all previous content, it was time for me to hop into the new hotness, Shadowbringers. The plot of the expansion branches off into a parallel world that's briefly touched upon in Heavensward, when a group of warriors of light from the First, one of several planets created alongside the one the player lives on, make mention of their homeworld being plagued not by darkness, but by light. A light so bright and pure that even life itself cannot be sustained under its rays. With Shadowbringers, we finally enter the First and its terrible curse of light, and from there, we experience something that's far more unique than anything Final Fantasy XIV has been able to offer thus far. The biggest thing I felt while playing through Shadowbringers was the sensation that I was playing a new Final Fantasy, one that could have easily been a standalone title, perhaps even 16 before the real 16 was announced and coincidentally revealed to be produced by our guy yoshi-p, and still could have been just as good. It was an entirely new, yet still vaguely familiar setting, with a ton of new characters, new rules, and it was all still very much parallel to the content in the source, the player's homeworld, while still feeling very fresh and compelling. It was like being in a twisted alternate dimension where the heroes of a normal Final Fantasy game screwed up and made the world worse by unleashing the threat of unchecked light. And that's basically what it is. That's exactly the backstory of the expansion. It's so impressive how the game manages to introduce and develop this new world in such a way that it almost makes me forget that I was over 500 playtime hours into the same game. Some of the new areas in the first were beautiful and enthralling, while still holding strong resemblances to their source counterparts, while others were so mystical and unique, like Ilmeg, that I almost wish we had areas like them in the base game. They reach a new, different level of mysticism that hasn't been explored yet. Story-wise, a huge contributor to the plot are its villains, specifically a mysterious but highly charismatic Ascian named Emmet Selk, who actually makes himself known very early on and does the whole, even though I'm your enemy, I'm going to play along and observe you all instead of fighting, and maybe I'll even help you out once in a while thing, which is a trope I honestly really like. Like with previous expansions, a couple new jobs were added. Here we're given Gunbreaker, a tank, and Dancer, a ranged DPS. Admittedly, I still haven't dedicated much time to either. In fact, I haven't even leveled up Dancer once. But I will say that I'm always happy to see Gunblades make a return in any Final Fantasy game. The music in Shadowbringers is also absolutely gorgeous. Masayoshi Soken has been the game's main composer ever since 1.0, and he's been knocking it out of the park ever since. The themes for trial bosses are all so damn good, I had to go on YouTube to listen to them over and over again. The Shadowbringers main theme and its leitmotifs are instantly recognizable and embed themselves into your head for days on end. Speaking of which, the new, exciting, bombastic main menu music is absolutely epic and fitting for the theme of traveling to a strange and dangerous new world. The mood is set the moment you start the game, before you actually log in. Seriously, the new tunes offered with this expansion are some of the best that Final Fantasy XIV has given to us to date. It just further bolsters the already incredible Shadowbringers experience. It's amazing, compelling, intriguing stuff, and my favorite of all the expansion stories in the game. It's just filled to the brim with worthwhile content, investing plots, enjoyable characters, stellar music, and entertaining dungeons and trials. It's a truly memorable adventure. When I reached the end of 5.0, I thought it couldn't get any better. I thought 14 had reached its peak, and the best I could hope for was that it simply maintained this level of quality from here on out, which I felt, and still feel, is completely possible for the team to do with their talent and the guidance of the passionate and competent yoshi-p. But, one by one, post-Shadowbringers story updates came out, and eventually, 5.3 arrived. Update 5.3 is what pushed Shadowbringers to even greater heights. It was the official end of the Shadowbringers storyline, and it couldn't have possibly ended in a better way. It delivered an impactful look back at our adventures and how everything changed around us, and how it all came together to this one conclusion. Even though the first only truly existed in the eyes of players for just one expansion, it felt like we were there for years, because we saw and accomplished so much. Shadowbringers felt like the final expansion of another related MMO, and somehow manages to be equally impressive and emotionally fulfilling. The day the 5.3 update came out was the day this entire expansion was elevated from arguably the best expansion, tied with Heavensward, to unquestionably the best expansion and possibly the best Final Fantasy content ever created. And it's what turned Final Fantasy XIV into my favorite game in the franchise and one of my favorite games of all time. It was the last push I needed to cement that change, and it wasn't an easy one to make, because the previous holder of that title was Final Fantasy X, and it held that position for nearly 20 years. My most favorite thing that 5.3 does is actually implement the Warrior of Light into the main scenario. No, I'm not talking about your character, I'm talking about the first hero of the Final Fantasy franchise, the Warrior of Light. It's a simultaneously small but gigantic reference that could have been really awkward or even just flaccid and disappointing if not cleverly pulled off. But yoshi-p and writer Natsuko Ishikawa, who wrote the boundary-breaking Dark Knight questline I mentioned earlier, pulled it off, and made it into a crowning moment of the narrative. I used to think Heavensward and Post-Heavensward were 10 out of 10 content, and it couldn't get any better than that. But by that same scale, Shadowbringers turned out to be an 11, and Update 5.3 pushed it to a 12. Obviously, the content doesn't stop at the main scenario. I mentioned earlier while talking about the Gunbreaker job that I always like seeing Gunblades, a weapon type that was born from Final Fantasy VIII back in 1999. But the FF8 references don't stop at just a new weapon and job. Let's head over and touch on the expansion's post-game content, starting with the Raid series, Eden. The Eden Raid is a giant throwback to Final Fantasy VIII on many levels. The name Eden isn't just a reference in itself. 14 actually takes the strongest Guardian Force summon from Final Fantasy VIII, places it into Shadowbringers, and fully assimilates it into the world with its own lore and purpose. Down to its physical design and even its insanely long, grandiose summon animation turned into a massive attack in the first boss of the Raid series. It's a faithful recreation, and the area in which you travel to in order to begin the Raid story uses FF8's overworld theme, and multiple Raid bosses use FF8's boss theme. And another Raid boss actually has moves that reference the draw and junction systems from the game, while even using similar animation effects. It's incredible. One of the first videos I did on this channel was about how weird the junction system for that game was. For those who do not know, 8 was the first Final Fantasy game I ever played. It is divisive and honestly not my favorite, but it still has a special place in my heart. And this series of raids practically brought a tear of nostalgia to my eye as I played through it. It was an amazing experience that fulfilled me immensely, not only as a Final Fantasy VIII fan, but as a 14 fan too, because these raids were really fun and the subplot of it was very closely tied to the main scenario. It just goes to show that Final Fantasy XIV is a game made by people who also know and love Final Fantasy, because these raids have been extremely fun and tastefully implemented in their references to past titles, while also being very friendly to its in-universe lore. It's a prime example of competent fan servicing if I've ever seen one. Then there's the Trial series, The Sorrow of Wurlid, which centers around Gaius, believe it or not, and his personal relationship with the adopted children he had to leave behind in Garlemald. It's a very insightful stretch of content that offers not only tough boss fights, but also additional detail into the inner workings of the Garlean Empire and the corruption that festers within. I won't go into too much detail because if there's one piece of side content that deserves a fresh experience, it's this. But I will say that The Sorrow of Wurlid is the most emotionally resonant Trial series out of all the expansions thus far, and it gives a ton of great development to a character who very much needs it. Also, these trials have the Ruby, Emerald, Sapphire, and Diamond weapons from Final Fantasy VII, so there's the obligatory awesome fan service for that. You also get to pilot a giant mech called the G-Warrior, which is also really cool. Basically, this subplot has everything, and if you've made your way through Shadowbringers without touching it yet, I strongly recommend you fix that and go back and do it. Then we have the Alliance raids featuring not Final Fantasy characters and settings, but Nier Automata characters and settings instead, and it's still more of an anomaly beyond that. While Stormblood Alliance raids were related to Final Fantasy Tactics, they aren't actually canon to Final Fantasy Tactics. Shadowbringers Alliance raids, however, are related to Nier Automata and are canon to Automata's storyline. Why? Because Yoko Taro is a fucking madman, that's why. We're talking about a guy who decided to make a stage play canon to Nier as well, so, if anything, we should be thankful that new additions to his story are at least back in video game form again. But anyways, this set of Alliance raids are a thing to behold. They're fun, flashy, and full of typical Nier weirdness. It'll be a wildly strange experience for anyone who hasn't played the Nier games, but for those who have, it'll be a great time. Overall, Shadowbringers as a whole isn't just the best expansion that Final Fantasy XIV has. It's also a very strong contender for the best thing that has Final Fantasy in its title. It has the best story content so far, and it has my personal favorite normal raid series and trial series. It may be an expansion to an MMO, but I personally place it at the top of the franchise mountain next to the other greats. It had everything I could have wanted not only from a Final Fantasy game, nor only from an MMO, but from a video game, period. It's truly the ideal penultimate expansion before the one that ends it all. It's a culmination of everything we felt and learned from A Realm Reborn and through Heavensward and Stormblood. A summary of our past adventures as well as a taste of what's to come, all wrapped up with a neat little bow. Probably the only complaint I've ever seen given to Shadowbringers' story is that removing the Scions from their homeworld and placing them somewhere else turns the expansion into something akin to filler content. And while I can see how some people may reach that conclusion, that's simply not true. Throughout Shadowbringers, details are given on how the fate of other parallel worlds influence events on the source, specifically umbral calamities, and how the destruction of those worlds cause living beings to rejoin. But arguably the most important thing that this expansion does is give much needed depth to the Ascians, adding more dimensions to them so that they're no longer just mustache-twirling, shadowy figures with unknown motives as they have been for years. It's the most tightly written and tightly designed experience we could have possibly received. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, it's clear as day that you love the game, but after so many hours, surely you have some criticisms of it too. That is a fair question, and the answer is, yes, I do. Quite a few actually. Obviously, no MMO is truly perfect. Oftentimes, they get at least some content that's just not as good or interesting as the rest. Or, in the case of PvP, it sometimes feels like it just exists to fulfill a certain niche and is lucky to get any more attention from the devs after it's out there. 14 has stuff like this too. Eureka isn't terribly popular due to its purposefully grindy nature, and the Diadem used to be pretty disliked until it was completely overhauled years later to fit the Ishgardian restoration. I'll admit I almost exclusively focus on MSQ and the big content, so to speak. But after coming from Warframe, I completely understand the concerns of players who enjoy a certain piece of content that is pretty far divorced from the main attractions like the MSQ and raids, yet it feels like the devs don't really have an interest in improving on that content or adding to it further. Part of me worries that Island Sanctuaries are going to be one of those things, but we'll have to see how that content works out when it's released. I know PvP is pretty far from being the #1 reason people play this game, but a decent chunk of the community is passionate about it and wishes the dev team gave it more love, and I very much sympathize with that. There's also the mentor system, and while I'm not a mentor myself and have no intention of becoming one, every single discussion I've ever seen of it just makes it sound very unintuitive and oftentimes even counterproductive. Because it's one thing to be willing to teach, it's another thing to be put into a party of players who are not willing to learn. Then of course you have people who have no interest in teaching at all and are only in it to have that crown icon next to their name. And one big thing that does occasionally bother me within the MSQ itself is my character's total lack of agency. The game offers the semi-frequent dialogue option to give the vague illusion of choice, but sometimes our lack of real, consequential choice is just really obvious. Our Warrior of Light simply never does anything without being told to do it first. I get that this is something that's very difficult to address in a game like this, especially 8 years in, so I ultimately overlook it, and it's easy to do so most of the time. I just wish those choices we get on occasion had real weight to them. Maybe that's something that can be worked out in the next Final Fantasy MMO. Right now, we await the release of Endwalker, the expansion that is set to close off the Hydaelyn Zodiark conflict. We'll get new dungeons, new trials, new gear, we'll go to the fucking moon, and we'll burn our belts. I've only been an active player for just over 2 years, but I feel like I've been on this journey for much, much longer, and I mean that in a good way. Final Fantasy XIV truly stands among the best of what the MMORPG genre has ever had to offer, and as it gains popularity while the previous top dog is losing it, we get to watch, front and center, with our vision clearer than ever, as more and more people come to understand why the game has managed to be as good as it is, and experience only growth. Final Fantasy XIV is a game that knows it's good, and it isn't afraid to display that confidence by letting its players take breaks for a few weeks, months, or even a couple years, because it knows it has what it takes to draw them back eventually, without needing to resort to tiring grinds or shallow retainment mechanics that force you to log in every single day if you want to make meaningful progress in some obtuse way that might not even matter in the long run. It simply allows its stellar story, naturally engaging content, and fun mechanics to speak for themselves. It's an MMO you can sink hundreds or thousands of hours into and never have it feel like a job. The developers listen to their community and play their own game. They understand the player perspective and strive to improve the experience whenever they feasibly can. They offer a level of transparency that bigger, more arrogant companies would never care to give. There's an immense amount of personal investment and sincere interest from both the players and developers here. It doesn't feel like a one-sided relationship where the players speak or even yell, only to end up ignored. When you combine all of that with the fact that the closest competitor is a sinking ship and its developers try to get rid of the water by drilling more holes into the hull, it's no wonder that Final Fantasy XIV is the new top dog. With the fairly recent explosion in popularity for the game, one of many over the years, but definitely the largest so far, I got to see a lot of former World of Warcraft players finally give the game a fair shake, some of whom after dismissing it as something that probably paled in comparison to Blizzard's flagship title. This is a perspective that I never experienced myself. I might have touched WoW for a few minutes years ago, but I was never within a country mile of considering myself a WoW player. I never had any comparisons between the two games going on in my mind while playing through 14. But with WoW turning into a giant chore that many longtime players dislike or outright hate now, they needed a new MMO home to turn to, and 14 was the most obvious choice for many. It was really eye-opening to see such an immense number of people experience a fun, no-nonsense, transparent game again after so many years of tolerating Blizzard's growing ineptitude and stubbornness. I got to see firsthand a lot of former World of Warcraft content creators remember what they loved about the genre to begin with, because Final Fantasy XIV rekindled that flame after Blizzard spent years kicking dirt into it. It drew out emotions they hadn't felt in years, or even at all.
Oh man! Fuck!
Take it. We fight as one.
For many of them, they're not WoW refugees anymore. Now, they're fellow Eorzeans. Not long before this video went up, two things were announced. First, that 14 had become the most profitable Final Fantasy title ever. This is important because the key word here is profitable. That means 14 makes Square Enix the most money even after you subtract development costs. That is insane, especially when you consider the fact that this game was essentially made twice. Second, that it also surpassed 24 million registered players. For comparison, that figure was 4 million back in 2015 and 10 million in 2017. That means the player base has grown by 6 times since Heavensward and more than double since Stormblood. This game has been the textbook definition of an industry success story. Final Fantasy XIV entered the world with a very rocky start in 1.0, but it was eventually reborn into something that possessed great promise. Going from the original launch back in 2010, which was an utter disaster ripped apart by fans and critics alike and cost Square Enix an unprecedented amount of money, to the biggest phenomenon in current-day MMOs is nothing short of one of the greatest turnarounds in gaming history, if not the greatest. If yoshi-p and his team were any less competent, they probably would have let that potential run away from them. But they didn't. They knew what they had, and they took the proper steps to craft something truly remarkable. It took time, effort, and many sleepless nights, but soon their countless hours of work combined to create a world of incredible detail, featuring amazing characters, gorgeous settings, enthralling plot lines, fun combat, entrancing music, and one of the most gratifying MMO experiences offered today. Whenever an online game goes on for years and years, through countless updates, hotfixes, and patches, the community eventually reaches a point where they look back and say, "Man, do you remember the good old days of this game? Do you remember the peak of this game's time in the spotlight? When activity was high, the content was at its best, and everyone was just unashamedly in love with the experience they were having? Do you remember that?" That's what we're going through right now with Final Fantasy XIV. We are in the good old days. We are in the period of this game's life where everything just seems ideal. 10, 15, maybe even 20 years from now, we'll be looking back on our time here with a smile, thankful that we were able to be a part of something so incredible. If we're lucky, the game will still be active and receiving quality updates. If we're not so lucky, we might have moved on to other games, trying, and probably failing, to find another experience that offers the same high. I suppose there's always a chance that things could end up going sideways in one way or another, but as of right now, in this lead up to Endwalker, it all simply feels fantastic. This concludes my reflection on my Final Fantasy XIV journey. This was a lengthy video, especially for me, but it meant a lot to finally make it. If you've made it this far in, thank you for your time, and I'll see you in Endwalker.